Today we find Mr. Good going out to visit someone to tell them about Jesus. God tells us to witness in the Bible. Do you remember the Bible verse?
Mark 16:50. Go ye into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature.
Mr. Good has been asked by Mr. Peppermint to go and talk to a candy that we've already met. Can you guess who Mr. Good might be going to visit?
Now, Mr. Good, I need you to go and visit Mr. Snickers.
So Mr. Good went, and he came to Mr. Snickers' house and knocked on the door very loudly. Mr. Snickers came to the door laughing that someone would knock on his door so loudly.
Do you think I can't hear very good, Mr. Good? Oh, what a jolly good joke, jolly good.
Well, instead of laughing, Mr. Good invited Mr. Snickers to church and told Mr. Snickers about what they were learning in Sunday school. Mr. Snickers did stop laughing for a few minutes, but when Mr. Good began to tell Mr. Snickers that they were learning about how Jesus loves everyone and that Jesus died for everyone's sins, Mr. Snickers started snickering again. Mr. Snickers thought it was so funny that Mr. Good, who was so good, had ever even sinned. Then Mr. Snickers started telling jokes and wouldn't let Mr. Good talk anymore. Well, Mr. Good left Mr. Snickers' house, determined not to give up on Mr. Snickers. He knew Mr. Snickers would not go to heaven when he died, and Mr. Good really did want to see Mr. Snickers in heaven someday. So Mr. Good kept praying for Mr. Snickers. Mr. Good prayed that God would bring someone into Mr. Snickers' life that he would listen to. The next day, a very strange thing happened. A brand new family moved into Sweetsville, right across the street from Mr. Snickers. Mr. Snickers thought this was great because now he had someone new to tell jokes to. Do you know what was special about this family? Well, they were Christians, and their name was the Lifesaver family. The very first thing they did was ask Mr. Snickers if he knew where the church was. Well, of course, Mr. Snickers knew where the church was. And he did tell them, even if he was laughing at the whole thing. Well, soon Mr. Snickers didn't think it was so funny anymore. The father came over to tell Mr. Snickers about Jesus. The mother brought over a chocolate pie and told Mr. Snickers about how Jesus had helped them move and find a nice new house. The children came over every week and recited the Bible verses they had learned in Sunday school. They even sang Jesus Loves Me to Mr. Snickers. Mr. Snickers soon stopped laughing and started listening to what this new family was telling him. Mr. Snickers realized that funny jokes are a lot of fun, but making fun of people wasn't nice at all. Mr. Snickers soon realized that he needed to ask Jesus to forgive him for always making fun of everyone. And then Mr. Snickers asked Jesus into his heart to take him to heaven when he died. Well, the next Sunday, Mr. Snickers asked the Lifesaver family if he could go to church with them. Can you imagine how excited everyone was in the First Church of Sweetsville when they saw Mr. Snickers come to church? Mr. Snickers went straight to Mr. Peppermint and Mr. Good. Mr. Snickers told them that he had asked Jesus in his heart, and Mr. Snickers also said that he was very sorry for making fun of them for so long. Well, of course, Mr. Peppermint and Mr. Good forgave Mr. Snickers. They were so happy to know that Jesus had answered their prayers for Mr. Snickers. Well, later, on the way home from church with the Lifesaver family, Mr. Snickers asked the Lifesaver family how they got their name. The Lifesavers told him that they had told so many people about Jesus that people started calling them Lifesavers. Mr. Snickers was very glad that the Lifesaver family wasn't afraid to tell him about Jesus so many times.
Did you know that Jesus wants us to be lifesavers too? Proverbs 11:30b says, "He that winneth souls is wise." We're smart to tell people about Jesus so that they can go to heaven too.
Sometimes it takes a long time for someone to ask Jesus into their heart, just like Mr. Snickers. Sometimes our friends will laugh at us. We need to keep praying for our friends and keep telling them about Jesus, just like Mr. Peppermint and Mr. Good did to Mr. Snickers.